today what we're looking at is actually the Brian Crower stroker kit for the BK20 or the 2.0T Genesis Coupe. This is actually my first time dealing with one of these stroker kits, and I thought I'd do the review as a complete kit rather than as just the individual components, because some of them don't actually have that much to talk about. We'll start off with the crank. Now the crank is a forged billet CNC machined piece. It uses the 4B11T or the Evo X Conrod journals. It uses the OEM Hyundai crank journals or main journals, whatever you choose to call them. All of the provisions on it have been modified to support a Hyundai rather than the 4B. You get this little piece of paper. Now when I had originally gone through the box, I did not see this paper, but they give you this little piece of paper. It tells you the part number, what it was cut for, rod center to center, the stroke. This is a 98mm stroke, so without a bore it will take us to 2.2 liters, just like the BTR CC Genesis Coupe from SEMA last year. And it uses the same OEM thrust bearings, and it uses, according to this, equal sized mains and conrods, and I'll be verifying that later. We did have this one balanced by them, so there are the drill marks in it for where they needed to take weight. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have a weight for this, what it exactly weighs, but it is considerable. Weight wise, it's on par with the factory one, if not a little bit heavier. It's not been knife edged, well, a little bit, not much. There is a little bit of manicuring to it, but on the throws themselves there is no manicuring at all. There's a clearance groove that was machined into the last throw, and that's basically the gist of it. There's not really that much. It's a crank, so there's not much to talk about. We're really looking forward to seeing, what we can do with it. Everything should be done. There's no treatment or anything. You'll see like these little, I'm not sure if they're going to show up in the video, but it looks kind of like pitting bearing surfaces, and that's not. It's just a lubricant to prevent rust and oxidization. So, but you don't touch those with your fingers if you're doing something like this. Here at the end and like here at the ends, they're fine. And make sure that if you're going to be long-term storing a crank that you suspend it, you don't lay it down, because laying it down will increase the chance of it warping. So yeah, we're going to go with this, and then we're going to talk about the conrods and pistons, which are kind of a little bit more fascinating than just this crankshaft. Quality wise, I'd say it's pretty high. It's OEM quality, if not a little bit better. The work that they've done to it seems to be pretty much spot on. I do have a questionable tactic of theirs that I'll discuss later on. That's the crank. So we'll move on to the pistons, or we'll move on to the conrods next. Now we're going to talk about the connecting rods. Now these connecting rods are pretty much Evo 10 stroker conrods. You can't use them in a regular BK crank. We opted in this build to go for the 625 plus end bolt. They're good for a really high amount of horsepower, to be perfectly honest, but I don't like using this method, but they use a tensile strength, which for these are 250,000 psi, versus their regular ones, which I believe are 40 or 130 or something like that. These are supposed to be the stronger rods. Now they weigh in at just about 600 grams. This set here is balanced to 599 grams for the set, and they're a forged steel conrod. Basically, I'm going to be honest, if you guys saw my review on the K1 conrods, these are basically almost completely identical, like to the point where I would think the K1 made these rods. They're very, very similar in weight. They're very similar in design. They're very similar in sizing. And even their numerology system on the side of them is very much the same. So they're basically, now I'm not to offend anybody in saying this, they're basically a K1 rod, which is not a bad rod in any way, shape, or form, just FYI. But I'm not sure if they are unique, if they're made by BC, and I'm not too concerned with whether or not they are or not. So, but these also require the 4B11T bearings, also, obviously, because the Hyundai bearings are a different size. So they're basically K1 rod, and you guys have seen that before, and they're nicely packaged. I would say the packaging that BC does is superior to the factory packaging from Wiseco/K1. The BC box is much better packed. I prefer their system of doing it. I know it's kind of funny to talk about packaging sometimes, but this box here, I wouldn't have any complaints about it being shipped across the country. Whereas the K1 rods, I made sure that they were done properly, that they were rebalanced to make sure. Now, speaking of that, I had mentioned earlier that that BC does something that I'm not particularly too fond of, and what they do is they neutral balance the crank, and then they manufacture their rods in big batches, okay? And then what they do is they take from those batches whichever rods are the most similar, and then they just pair them together. So you'll have your big end and your small end, which is the wrist pin side and the crankshaft side, okay? And what they'll do is they'll measure them. They'll measure big end weight, and then they'll measure small end weight, and then they will match them up into sets of 4 for plus or minus 1 gram. I'm not a big, huge fan of that methodology, just to be blunt. I prefer them to be remachined down to their correct weight. But since the variance is no more than a gram between all 4 rods, it's going to be pretty smooth. Now, neutral balancing the crank is the correct way to do it, and that's the way I would prefer to do it. I just don't prefer their methodology of balancing the con rods. I'd prefer them to arrive machined to within half a gram or better. Now, my client is opting to just go this route rather than have everything rebalanced. That's, his choice. It's his money. But you guys did see on the Woodstock videos that I did have mine end-to-end balanced, and some of them had grind marks and stuff at the end of the day, and that's what I prefer. But BC, I mean, this is your best next way of doing it. Then we're going to talk about the CP pistons. Now, these kind of bother me a little bit, and not because they're shoddy quality. I mean, they're from the same brand as Carrillo. They are Carrillo, basically. You get like your swag and your rings and retainers and C-clips and stuff like that to pull this stuff out here. Those are all your rings. And then they give you this here, which is all of your specs, I guess you could say. You could take these specs and hand them off to somebody else who makes custom pistons, and they'd be able to make you a custom set of pistons, So that's really, they save you from having to look for that. If you guys want, I can give you guys a copy of it. But these are the CP pistons, and they are kind of interesting. For one, we'll start with packaging. The packaging on these is superb. Okay, these are excellently packaged. Again, probably better than Wiseco did on theirs. These pistons are incredibly light. These are nearly half the weight of my Wiseco pistons. They are a performance piston. Now, with less weight, okay, you generally don't have the material thickness in certain places that I would prefer, which is why on my daily driver, I opted for the heavier Wiseco pistons that had thicker wrist pin grooves, and they had a little bit of a different design to them. I can't fault CP for their design. I'm not a piston designer. I don't know the correct or not correct way of doing high performance pistons, to be perfectly blunt. But these are very, very light. Like, there is no way I could explain how light these are. Like, I can tell you that they are 287 grams, but that to most people won't mean anything. When my Wiseco pistons weighed in, I believe, 540 grams, there's a lot of weight difference between those two, and this is going to be a lot more free revving, a lot easier to get it up into the higher RPMs, because it's going to have less reciprocating mass, which means there's less losses. The other thing about it is that these ultimately won't affect top RPM, because they're a forged piston just like the Wisecos and just like the Manleys and all those other ones. So strength-wise, they're going to be nearly identical, except maybe the wrist pin section here. It might be a little bit thin and not as structurally strong. So that might have a bearing on it, but mostly it's going to have a bearing on your crown, which is this top section of your piston. And that's because this is actually what's going to be transferring the load. It's going to be pushing the load down, and that crown thickness is what's really going to be taking that load. This bottom section of the wrist pin is going to be kind of the stop as the piston comes up to top, and it's going to have to catch that weight. Less weight means that that generally doesn't need to be as strong. But we will see over the long term how these things react, because doing a bottom end inspection on these cars is not actually all that hard. The next thing on these would be they're very, very well machined. They don't have any kind of skirt coating or anything like that on them, which I would have preferred to see a skirt coating, especially for how much these things cost. They've obviously opted not to do that for whatever reason that they did. Skirt coatings don't really do much over the long term. They're mostly for when you first fire the engine up and it's got that lack of friction. And the machine work on this is not, I'm going to be honest, it's not fantastic on the skirt side. You can feel the CNC ridges. They didn't take any time to buff that out, to polish that out, and completely different than what than the Wiseco's that I did. So you are, in some respects, sacrificing some features in order to have a lighter weight piston. Wrist pins, which are these things here, they are the same material as a Wiseco and the same thickness as a Wiseco, or same overall diameter, I should say, but they're not as thick. So that I'm not sure is going to come into play, but considering the power we're after, that is nothing to really be concerned about, I guess. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a shortcut that I'm not too particularly impressed with. But it's a client's car, not my own, so I have to deal with whatever decisions they make. So that's the stroker kit in its entirety. Now you can opt with Brian Crower to not use CP. They do have optional JE pistons, which are probably equally as light, and I have no idea what features they have on them because I'm not a big fan of JE pistons in any way, shape, or form. I've seen too many failures. So I'm really happy that he went with CP, but I would have been a little bit happier if he went with a bit of a beefier piston. I know that sounds silly. So that's the stroker kit in a nutshell, and all of the features of the parts that come with it. Now there are the rod bearings, but I mean they're rod bearings. They're made by ACL, so they're good. That's about it. Everything else is going to be either factory or the main bearings. We're trying to source a set of ACL main bearings for that. Just moving forward from that point on. So hope you guys like this review. Hope it demystifies some of the stroker kit components, because I know that it is a really expensive option. And for us, these are stock bore, by the way. These are 86 millimeter pistons. We opted to maintain the stock bore and just use the stroker, added additional torque and exhaust volume. The reason we did that is because just in case of the event of a failure, we can bore the sleeves to whatever we want. Now we are using Darton sleeves, and I'll be taking a quick peek at those in another video. But that's what we're doing, is we're going with 2.2 to start with, and then if something does happen down the road, he's got room to expand into that sleeve, versus going, the full Monty right away, going like an 89 or 90 millimeter bore, and then having no room whatsoever. So not everybody's made of money, and we're kind of making big horsepower on as much of a budget as we can. So we will talk to you guys in the next video and continue to look forward. Oh, by the way, don't forget to check out our website, www.snoopypanda.com. All of the latest reviews and tutorials are going to be posted up there, so you've got one concise place to go, and we're going to be doing a bunch more stuff on the website as things progress and things expand. So we will see you guys next time.